Good evening to you. In this edition of the Ballot Briefs business segment, macroeconomic dynamics take center stage as analysts highlight the glaring and concerning dynamics that call for urgent political attention post the upcoming elections. The local political and economic landscape has come into sharp focus as criticism has been leveled at the minor progress that has been made in the economic climate since 30 years of realizing democracy. Analyst Peter Attard Montalto discusses this with us. Good evening to you, Peter. It is a time difference from where you are in London, but let's first unpack the macroeconomic factors at play in South Africa before we get to how they then change in terms of what a political party is going to go into, stepping into office as the seventh administration.
Good evening. Well, the growth dynamic at the moment is pretty weak in the first half of the year. We're expecting it to pick up a little bit in the second half after the election, after some uncertainty falls away. But the data we've had this week and last week, pretty weak for Q1, weaker than expected. But looking back over the whole administration, of course, jobs growth has been exceptionally weak. We shouldn't forget, even looking through COVID, the role of government is not to create, one or two jobs around the place. It's to have a pace of employment growth that is faster than the growth of the labor market. And that's what's not happened. And hence, we've seen a couple of percentage point rise in unemployment across the administration. Of course, a huge amount of work's been done in terms of reforms that haven't fully bedded in yet. And that's really where we can see the picture maybe starting to turn around after the election. But in the sense of this current administration, it's been too late to really force those macro growth numbers from the sort of 1 to 2% that we've seen across the administration up towards, say, 3, 4, 5% on the year, which would then have a more meaningful impact on employment growth.
So what type of political policy is required here? Because the past 30 years have seen quite little progress in this regard, be it political will for implementation, or we look on the flip side of the coin, incorrect policy.
Well, let's not forget the Mbeki administration that saw very fast growth in the period from 2002 to 2007 before the global financial crisis. Yes, some of that was on faster credit growth, though some of that was on financial penetration into lower income deciles as well that spurred some of that credit growth. But there was a period of fast credit growth where there was investor confidence. Of course, a lot of that then got stymied by the state capture and Zuma period. And then we're living with the consequences, the long, difficult tail of consequences from that period. And that's where investors still are very skeptical. There's been a huge progress in the last 2 years on structural reforms, but that are only the beginning. They take time to bed in, and investors have shown themselves to be very skeptical until we really see the implications of those reforms actually felt into headline growth. And that's going to probably be the story, I think, of the first half of the next administration.
On the back of that, what is the investor sentiment currently on South Africa pre the May 29 vote and the expectation of that the outcome, specifically when we look at coalition governments that, or rather coalitions that could emerge in government and not particularly speaking to a uniformity when it comes to a direction of policy?
So I think there are two sort of issues. Firstly, there's the underlying negativity, and I said, investors have not given benefit of the doubt on reforms so far. I think investors are too negative on the fact that we are on a sustainable path out of load shedding. It is going to take a while yet, looking through even the short run of the pause in load shedding. We are turning a corner on logistics as well. But the investors are still far too negative, I think, on fiscal action that Treasury's taken. As well, and there's obviously a lot of justifiable cause for concern. Things like FATF, we're not going to get off FATF as grey list for at least another year and a half or so as well. So there are obviously reasons. There was a lot of investment grade as well during this administration, but then there's the election on top as well. So in terms of the election, I think markets have had too negative a view for the last couple of months on the chances of the ANC's view or likelihood to go with the EFF or other extreme party coalition combinations. And so I think after the election, when some of that falls away, when maybe we see a much more status quo outcome with smaller parties in terms of then the policy that's implemented, and we see some maybe realization on this end of load shedding question, on the turnaround logistics, on better fiscal, we can actually have some positivity in the markets coming through at that point.
Interesting, because it brings me to my next question about the current outlook of South Africa's capital markets as well as investment climate in the lead up to the elections. In a sense of, will that positivity then maybe manifest into slightly better and improved dynamics in terms of how South Africa is looked at? At the same time, we know that rating agencies are watching closely.
So we've seen the currency, of course, rally, particularly since the start of May. I think that's as there's been some realization that some of those more extreme risks in terms of election outcomes are any tail risks. Slightly left in the bonds in terms of rallies. And, I think, as I said, some of that skepticism is not going to go away particularly easily. I think Treasury is going to have to, have some stern words with the market. The MTBPS will be very interesting, the medium-term budget in October, for showing that we're still on this consolidation path. But the turnaround in logistics is going to take 5 years or so to properly bed in, and so requires a huge amount of patience from market. So as a result, we see a little bit of a rally certainly after the election as some of the risk premium and uncertainty falls away. But it's going to take a while after that, I think, to properly see stronger asset prices coming through.
How then do we factor in the role of sentiment of ordinary South Africans, the citizenry that is essentially going to be voting in the next leadership?
So that's an interesting question. I mean, the market had a very sort of naive and overly simplistic view that, unsatisfied, individuals in the population would mean that you would get a switch to, a new government, or you would find, the opposition taking over. That was the view in markets 2 years ago. And of course, it's much more complicated than that. One needs alternatives to vote for. And so the markets have sort of abandoned that view, I think, of, service delivery, dissatisfaction, those sorts of things, maybe driving obviously a turnaround in outcome. Of course, we're seeing a very large drop in the ANC, of over sort of 12, 13 percentage points versus the prior election. This is a shock, let's not forget. But this is not quite the rupture maybe that the markets maybe were looking for, say, 2 years ago or so. And as a result, it's a stepping stone. And already the questions have started from market participants on 2029. We haven't even had 2 weeks' time in the election yet. But eyes will then turn to what happens in 2029 and the 2026 local elections. Let's not forget as well, and further continuation of this trend.
What's also quite fascinating is the new entrance of political parties, more promises that are being made with regards to their economic policy direction. How much of that is the voter looking at with regards to what we should be factoring in?
Well, I think this is where NHI is so interesting, and all the polling on issues and the focus grouping that goes on. NHI and health comes out pretty low, actually, versus crime, versus electricity, versus transport, access to labour markets, those sorts of issues. But some very, worrying almost expectation management going on around NHI. The Premier of Gauteng said the other week that people can rock up to private healthcare, straight after the election. That's not going to happen. I think I said on this program with Stephen, straight after the NHI bill passed the National Assembly, that the NHI in this form will never happen. That's still very strongly my view. It will be basically prevented through court cases. Around the fact it's unaffordable and it's not constitutional. And so, there are some big expectation management problems we have to watch around these things. And let's not forget on the NHI front as well, we need an NHI. The country needs an NHI, just not this NHI. And I think that point, again, will come out after the election. But, as much as we talk about structural reforms, I think we need to be careful. We're relatively optimistic on growth after the election, but actually it's not very labor intensive growth. We still have deep problems, obviously in health, but also in education, in productivity and skills as well, which needs solving as much as we talk about these big things like electricity and logistics.
I'm glad that you raised the point that you discussed with my colleague Stephen Grootes on NHI, and interesting views there. But I must also then maybe quiz you around the timing of the signing into law of that particular bill. Universal healthcare is much needed in South Africa, but the political landscape has called it maybe a gimmick.
Well, I mean, I think, as someone who studies the data on healthcare outcomes, these sorts of things, I think a lot of what was said yesterday bore no resemblance to, the international comparative studies on quality of the public healthcare system in South Africa. It's like the jobs sort of thing in the election. The government's very happy that it's created a couple of jobs, but not enough. Of course, there are some decent, MRI machines being rolled out somewhere in South Africa. That's not the hurdle what a decent universal public quality healthcare system should look like. And so yes, I think yesterday was very much, and if you listen to the speech from the president, it was clearly very much around the campaign tone. But I think this is the problem and the sort of acrimony that is coming out on the NHI issue. The president called people naysayers, etc. Everyone I think wants there to be an NHI, right, and a form of universal healthcare. And I think if one gets into too negative a place and too acrimonious a place, that will be all the harder to find where we can and how we can get a proper universal healthcare.
I agree with you on the tone that the president, as well as his cabinet, basically was interjecting with regards to the naysayers and the criticism that's leveled against NHI. And it kind of brings me to a next point around the political dynamics that have seemingly changed with regards to tone and the manner in which political heads then dispense communication to the rest of South Africa. Much of that tone could have been misinterpreted as they have this election in the bag.
Maybe. I mean, I think we've also seen a very conciliatory tone, particularly from former leaders coming out, people who've not been afraid to criticize the ANC, who've been on the campaign trail. We've seen that obviously, particularly in KZN, where the threat is obviously biggest with MKP and a number of other challenges. Even the DA, we shouldn't forget about, is doing relatively well in KZN. And in Gauteng as well, of course, where we have a very messy multi-party race, and a number of parties will get roughly similar sorts of figures in Gauteng. So no, I think there's been a range of different sort of tones the ANC's taken. What's been interesting is we've not actually had a proper argy-bargy argument over policy, of a ping-pong backwards and forwards in criticism of policy and positioning of others' policies. It's been very much a stand and deliver, a manifesto of a policy here or there, and I think that's given this campaign somewhat of a bizarre sort of framework. Actually, there's only so much one can argue, in the public domain on managerialism, on who can be able to manage the economy and manage government better.
Thank you for your input, MD at Macroeconomic there. That's Peter Attard Montalto talking to us in this business segment of the ballot brief about the economic landscape in South Africa leading up to the May 29 vote. That's how we wrap it up. It's now back to Stephen and Vuyo.